Welcome to the Craftsman Founder Podcast, hosted by Lucas Carlson. Every week, we talk to founders, entrepreneurs, and those who've made a craft out of creating companies and enterprises. Listen every week to get ideas for starting, promoting, and growing your business. There are no shortcuts, just good old-fashioned hard work and craft. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's interview.
Hello, this is Lucas Carlson from the Craftsman Founder Podcast. Today, we've got a really great guest. He's written a really excellent book that everybody should pick up and read. It has some fantastic advice. We have Patrick McGinnis to talk about the 10% Entrepreneur. So welcome to the show, Patrick, and thanks for coming.
Thanks, Lucas. Good to be here.
So before we get into the book, tell our audience a little bit about yourself. How did you get into entrepreneurship? What's your background?
So I got into entrepreneurship a little bit in a circuitous fashion, let's say. I started out my career as a venture capitalist, so I was used to investing in, say, risky ventures, but I was more of a safety kind of guy. I was working at large companies, JP Morgan, and then after business school, I went to a private equity fund that was a part of AIG. So in 2008, when AIG blew up, I realized that I should have probably been doing things on the side the whole time. And then I had this kind of epiphany that I wanted to become more entrepreneurial.
So how did you get the money to start doing the angel investing?
So I had been saving over the years. I mean, I'd worked for over a decade. And so I'd always been a saver, and I put aside money over time. And so what I decided to do, I wanted to invest, but I also thought, I don't want to put all of my money into early stage ventures. It doesn't make a lot of sense for me. So how can I do something that allow me to invest, but in a way that makes sense for my life? And so I decided I'd set aside 10% of my capital and just start investing it. And once I got going, then I thought to myself, well, that's great. I've got all this capital, but why don't I also try to use my time? And so I tried to set aside about 10% of my time to trade that for sweat equity. So it was, from the beginning, the idea was a limited amount that was meaningful, and I guess it's like a tithe. It's 10%, which is traditionally what a tithe is. It's something that's meaningful to you, but isn't going to totally sort of alter your entire financial sort of profile.
Yeah, and I love this idea because I think that the whole concept that to be an entrepreneur, you have to be the next Mark Zuckerberg is one of the biggest fallacies of the world, not just in terms of needing to make your startup be the biggest thing in your whole entire life to have it be successful, but also the idea that you need to be 20-something. You started getting into investing in startups later in life, and a lot of your background is around people. I think that's that kind of thinking about taking that 10% of time and money, and you can be entrepreneurial with it. People don't realize that there are different ways to approach getting into entrepreneurship, and I think that's a really powerful message. You have some really great anecdotes in the book from people who have applied these lessons to their everyday life. Can you share some of those with our audience?
Sure. So when I decided to write the book, I had a couple of, I guess, goals for myself as a writer, because I did this because I believe in it, and I wanted it to get out to people and really resonate with everybody. So my biggest concern was people would look at me and say, well, that's great for you, but I'm not like you. I'm different than you. I don't live in your country, or I don't have your background, or whatever it is. And so I made it my sort of purpose to find people from all over the world. We have 9 countries on 4 continents, and we have people at all different stages of life, and men and women and students and moms and all kinds of different people. So a couple of the stories that I really like, without ruining the whole set of 30, is I think one of the ones that really resonates with me is a guy named Luke Holden.
Yes.
Luke is from Maine, just like me. And in fact, I interviewed him up in Maine last winter. And he grew up in a small town and was a lobster fisher during the summer. He built his own lobster boat. And then he went off to college and found himself on Wall Street. And one day he wanted a lobster roll, and he lived in New York City. And back before, in the prehistoric days of 5 or 10 years ago, you can only get sort of like a $35 lobster roll. And so he decided that he knew what lobster rolls should be. He had lived this experience of having this more laid back kind of lobster roll where you don't pay $35. And so he also understood the seafood industry. His father had been a seafood trader. He had been a lobsterman. And so he decided to open a very simple lobster shop, which became Luke's Lobster. And he ran the company for the first year, basically, while he was working full time. He brought in a partner who could be there during the day. And now the company has over 20 stores all over the States and also in Japan. And he's built this really amazing company that is, tremendously valuable. It's a fantastic business. That's one of the ones that I like because it's not a tech play per se. We also have lots of great stories about people that build sort of techie plays. And one of the fun ones is a guy named Diego Saez-Gil, who's from Argentina. And he had a company called We Hostels that I was an investor in. And he raised a couple $1 million and it did reasonably well. And he sold it to a strategic acquirer. And then he had this more stable job working as a division head in this business. And he, when you're an entrepreneur, you don't sort of hang up the old gloves overnight and decide like, I'm just going to be Mr. Corporate now. But at the same time, he was busy. And so he had this idea to build the world's first intelligent suitcase. And instead of doing it himself, he did it on the side with a partner who worked on it full time. And these are two partner examples. I have others where somebody just runs something themselves, but he brought in a partner. They ended up inventing the suitcase. A bunch of us chipped in a little money. Fast forward 2 years, he's now running the thing. It raised over $2 million on Indiegogo. They're all over the world. They just got an exclusive deal to sell out of Selfridges in the UK. They're on Amazon Launchpad, and they've raised a lot of money, and they did Y Combinator, and they've really created a tremendous business. So what I love about that is that Diego was the kind of guy who had built a business, sold it. It wasn't like a crazy exit. It wasn't like he could retire. He still had to work, and he still had stock in another company, but he didn't give up on his dreams, and he used everything he learned as an entrepreneur the first time around to build a bigger, better, even more exciting business that is going to really, I think if you look at a business like Blue Smart, they're reinventing an entire category.
That's so cool. And I love the idea that I think what you are talking about in this book takes together a lot of concepts that I think really resonate with me strongly. Nassim Taleb's anti-fragile concept, where things with limited downside that have unlimited upside. I think this whole idea of if you're investing 10% of your time and resources in something, you've got a capped downside. You know that you're not spending more than 10% of your time or money. Whichever you have more of, and earlier in your life you might have more time, and later you might have more money, or vice versa.
Right.
And whatever you have more of, you cap your downside, and that means that you can last longer. You can, if an idea is horrible and it goes to nowhere, you're not bankrupt. You still have a job. You can still have a livelihood. And James Altucher has been talking about this a lot in his podcast about how he only starts businesses and he only quits his job when the new business can really support him. But he doesn't go into a lot of details. What I loved about your book is how many anecdotes you had about real people that it was really approachable, that it felt like it's not a superhero. It's not, you don't have to be Mark Cuban to be a 10% entrepreneur.
And it's interesting, just on your point before, I found this, it's too bad I didn't find it before, but somebody just sent me a study that was done out of University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it was looking at part-time entrepreneurship as a way of launching new businesses. And if you look at the study, I believe it's by Raffi and Feng, but I may get that wrong. They discovered that it's all about option. You were creating option value for yourself. And if you look at real options theory, then you can exercise that option if it's valuable, if it's in the money. And so if you look at how those business outcomes end up sort of playing out, if you start a business full-time versus doing it part-time and joining, the chances are much higher that you will abandon the business if you do it full-time. So I think it's 33% lower chance of business abandonment if you do it part-time first.
Wow. Yeah, I totally believe it. And anecdotally, that totally jives with everything I've been hearing.
Yeah.
And then the other place that I've been hearing the same thing is in Tim Ferriss's podcast. Actually, he was also on Derek Sivers was also on the James Altucher podcast recently, and he was talking about something that I totally believe as well, is that any real great business should pull you into it by its gravitational force rather than you trying to make it survive, rather than you pushing it into existence.
Yeah.
The best startup ideas, like you said, are in the money, are the ones that you're not putting 100% of your livelihood into it just to keep it going. That they spark and they have this life of their own, and you're just along for the ride.
Absolutely. And yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, and the thing that I see that's complete waste of time is that the cost of keeping a business these days alive is so little that you can start a business, fail, and just kind of be a entrepreneur for the sake of your ego and to keep your friends thinking from you fail for the fact that you failed for a long time.
Yeah.
And that doesn't serve anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you say to somebody who wants to get started, who's been thinking about it forever, has been on the fence, wants to jump off, but isn't quite, doesn't feel quite ready? What would you say? What would your coaching be? I know in the book you have some great steps. How would you begin?
Well, I've done this. I've been lucky that this idea that I've done, and I've done it myself. So I ate my own cooking. I've got north of 15 projects or ventures that I've invested in. And so people have noticed and they come to me and ask me for help. And so that's why I wrote the book, because I thought, well, geez, I'm giving all this advice. I could probably be far more efficient if I just wrote it down. But so I've been through this with a lot of people, and I make it it's like a sideline for me to just find people their own 10% and get them plugged into stuff. So the way that I usually start is when we sit down with somebody is I talk about, first of all, what are the resources that you can allocate towards a 10% project? So can you realistically put money? Can you realistically put time? Can you put more of one or the other? And what can you really do? And then from there, we go into what are your skills? What do you actually understand how to do? What are you good at, and what do you want to be doing? Because you can be tremendously talented at what you do at your day job, but if you hate it, then why should you do it during your free time? At the same time, you could have a passion for cooking, but if you're not a very good cook, I wouldn't advise that you start a restaurant and cook behind the counter. So you've got to find that sweet spot where your interests and your skills overlap. Once you get all those things together, then you can ideate around the kinds of businesses that you'd like to start. And I have this process that I lay out in the book that shows you how to actually determine, it's a sort of a due diligence process, how to determine whether or not you should do a project. And then you add that together with your network and all the people you know who are going to help you to answer the questions you need to answer to be successful. They're going to help you find partners. They're going to help you to get into business. Take all those things together, and that's really what a 10% entrepreneur does. So it's a pretty, I spent about 2/3 of the book giving you really step-by-step, process and information, because what I wanted to do is make sure that anybody who reads this, and you don't need an MBA, I wanted it to be, if you don't have an MBA, you get it, and if you have an MBA, you still shake your head and learn something new, so that it's wide enough that it's, we're speaking at an intelligent level, but we're speaking at a level that people can grasp onto.
And can you outline the diligence process if our listeners are trying to figure out, they've got an idea, they're working on it, they're putting 10% of their time into it. What's the diligence process to make sure that they're not working on a dud idea that they shouldn't be spending time on?
So for me, I come at it from a perspective of having done a lot of investments over the years as a venture capitalist, working in big firms. And so I've made every mistake in the book. I have ended up in arbitration. I've seen my partner on the front page of the newspaper accused of sending money to Al-Qaeda. I mean, I've been through it.
Wow.
And that was not a great day for me. But he was let off, thank God. But as a result, I would say I've learned, at least from my own perspective, a lot of the things to not to do, I should say, and then a lot of the things you need to do. And so I've distilled those. The first thing, before I get into my 3 rules, the first thing that I talk about is don't be a follower, what I call a wildebeest. And you see this all the time when we're in a boom time. You see everybody wants to invest in the Uber of X. Well, my friend's starting the Uber of dog food. Well, great. Uber's successful. Let's invest. Obviously, a lot of those followers are going to fail. And I would rather fail because I had conviction than fail because I was trying to follow somebody who's probably not as smart as I think they are. So that's the first thing that I really hammer down in that part of the book. Then there are 3 rules, and the first 2 are pretty obvious. They're things that if you're not doing them, I'm a bit worried about you. But the third is one that I specifically I think is a little unique to me anyway, and I hope that other people use. So the first 2 are, do you understand how the business makes money, how it works, why the industry is attractive, and why it's a good business? The second is, do you know the people? Do you know who they are, the partners? Do you have a significant relationship with somebody who is a decision maker in the company? And the third, which is my special one, is can you tangibly add value? And that means for me personally, I've defined that as either you can increase the revenues, or you can bring capital to the table, or critical hire, or somebody else who's going to make the business. Really, people will be able to point back and say, Patrick did this, and that moved our business appreciably. And so if I don't think I can do that, then I know I don't know the people well enough. I know I don't know the industry well enough, and I know that it's not the right place for me to invest.
Makes sense. Yeah, I've been going through this same process myself because I've quit my job, taken some time off to reflect, and going through the entrepreneurial process again. And just like what you were talking about, I've had asked those same questions of myself. I had an idea for a startup around monetary advice, giving people advice about how to invest their money. And I had to ask myself some of those same questions. And even as somebody who's gone through it before, you can still fall into those same traps. It doesn't matter that you've done it before. You could still fall in. The traps are so seductive sometimes because even though I had this great idea, it might not have. I didn't know how to bring it to market. I didn't know the right people that would want to buy it and how to get in front of them and how to talk to them. And so luckily for me this time, in my youth, when I had an idea like that, I would go after it full bore and it would take all my time and resources. Now I approach it like you're talking about, more 10%. And so testing it out, seeing it, throwing it against the wall before really digging myself into any idea. And so that one I can pass up on and let myself wait for the next opportunity. Because I think that's when you're investing 10%, you have 90% more time for another thing to cross your desk.
Definitely. And also, it depends, you may want to found a company, and there are sort of different types of 10% entrepreneurs. So if you're a founder, you need to be more focused, at least in the outset. But you may want to be an investor and advisor, and you're going to look at all kinds of things. And so I've probably looked at 300 things over the last 5 years, and I've done about 15. So we're at about 5% hit rate, which is about what VC funds do. According to my research, maybe they do a little lower. But that's what you want to do. You don't want to kiss everybody at the party. You want to find your soulmate.
Yeah, and it seems to me like a lot of the entrepreneurs I talk to, they feel like they found their soulmate, but it was the first person they kissed.
Yeah.
And it's often a long, difficult process to have them come to realize. It seems like nothing I can say makes them aware that they have committed too early to the wrong idea.
Yeah.
And usually I just have to, be there and encourage them while they work their way through, eventually realizing that they had dove in too fast, too soon, and had kind of blocked their eyes off at other opportunities.
Right.
And so for people that have very few resources, like people in Africa, we have a bunch of listeners in Africa. What would you say to them? How should they approach being a 10% entrepreneur?
Well, that's great. And I'm glad that you have listeners in Africa, because I had the opportunity last year to actually talk about this whole topic in Mozambique. And I also talked about it recently, about a month ago in Morocco. So I've tested this out on audiences there and also in Latin America. And I get this question all the time, and it's a great question. First of all, I think it's important for us all to recognize, and I think we touched on that a bit earlier, but the decline in the cost of entrepreneurship is extraordinary. So it was 10 years ago, building a website was tens of thousands of dollars. Now it's basically free. A gigabyte of storage cost $8,000 10 or 15 years ago, which is it's a lot of money. Now you can get them at Staples basically free by the cash, or you can get on the cloud for basically free. So the cost of entrepreneurship and connectivity is so much lower, which is great for people in Africa or anywhere else in the world that isn't like New York or Europe or something like that. At the same time, you do need to operate within the realities of your ecosystem. And so what I tend to tell people, and I've seen it works quite well, is a couple of things. The first is most anywhere you go in the world, and I've seen this firsthand, has an entrepreneurial ecosystem that is forming. In Morocco, where when I visited, so surprised me was there wasn't a ton of capital, but there was some capital, and there were accelerators, and the government was investing, and there were ways to plug in. But the other thing that's really interesting is there are so many great ways for you to use your skills to make money, to invest in your business. If you think about Upwork is Elance Odesk, it's the combination. So Upwork is the largest employer in the country of Pakistan.
Wow.
There are over 2 million people, I believe, working for Upwork. And those people make pretty good money doing different types of jobs that are all human capital jobs. These are jobs that you use your brain for. And they can take that money and invest it back into what they're doing. So the wonderful thing about the connectivity in this globe is that if you're smart and you have a skill, you can connect and you can market your skill all over the world and then use the experience that you've gained and the capital and the money that you've made to invest in things that are relevant to you that you want to pursue.
Yep, that makes a ton of sense. The other thing that came to mind when I was reading your book was being a writer, because you obviously wrote this book, and I like to write books. A lot of people that come to me and they say that they want to write a book, they don't realize that when you're a writer, often you don't write 8 hours a day. It's not like the clock in, clock out kind of job. In fact, a lot of the time writing takes so much creative energy that there's only a few number of hours in a day that you can even put into it at all. And a lot of best-selling authors that you see their names in airports, they only write for 2 to 4 hours a day, tops.
Yeah, that's right.
And they do it before they go into their day job. A lot of them don't even make enough money to do it full time, and they do it in the mornings. Do it at night after the kids fall asleep, and that's when I do it as well. I do it in the mornings and at night, and I just do it in a few hours of my day. It's far from an 8-hour job, and I think that being an author and investing 10% of your time writing a couple pages per day is a really interesting approach to entrepreneurship that a lot of people, you don't have to build the next Facebook to be an entrepreneur.
That's definitely true. And my experience, I never intended to write a book. This is just something that happened in my life that's been wonderful. But it was something that I started writing simply because I thought it would be good for me and I wanted a creative outlet. I had been through this experience in 2008 with my job blowing up. And so I thought, well, why don't I write and just see what I can get out on the page. And I actually wrote a horrible fiction book that if it ever comes to light will end my career as a writer. But what I learned through that, and I probably wrote 1,000 words a day, and it was so low stress because I never showed it to anybody. It was just for me.
Yep.
But I probably wrote 25,000 words, and then I looked up one day and I said, well, first of all, I'm making time to write, which tells me I enjoy it.
Yep.
And number two is, wow, I just wrote, because I wrote for the Huffington Post, 800 words and this and that. But I sort of realized, wow, I've written 25,000 words. That's like, almost half a book for the business space. And so then I started writing about this concept of 10%, which is something that I knew and understood. And so I think you're right. I think in creating content that you can put out into the world, and I talk about this in the book, is so critical towards building a profile of yourself, of who you want to be, because we put things out into the world and we never know what will happen with them. I wrote an article about FOMO when I was in business school that was just something that me and my friends talked about. It was a term we used. Little did I know, 10 years later, I would be credited with inventing the term FOMO, and that would be the factor that got me my book deal.
Yeah.
You knew that, I couldn't get run over by a publicist until the FOMO thing happened, and then people were interested in meeting with me because they were, I had a little baby tiny platform, and that's what publishers are looking for. So had I never put that content out there, I would have never had that opportunity. So I really encourage people to just put things out onto the web, tell the world who you are, sort of plant your flag about what you care about, and then nothing bad can come of that as long as you're not, flaming people and being rude.
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic point. And I also have a similar story in that my first book was the Ruby Cookbook, which is a programming book that I kind of accidentally came into. I happened to know a guy at O'Reilly who was like, hey, you should write this book. I was like, oh, I know Ruby, sure, why not? I didn't do it thinking ahead to what it would mean to my future, and I think it was critical to my ability to raise venture capital for my startup that I had my name on a prominent programming book, but it wasn't planned. And I think that's those kinds of events in my life have been the most transformative. Those little things that you just put out and you didn't realize would make any difference.
So true.
Really end up making all the difference. Great. Well, I think that's a wonderful point to end on, and I really appreciate your time, and thank you for explaining to us these concepts. And absolutely pick up the book, The 10% Entrepreneur. Where's the best place to get it?
Probably any bookstore, but obviously Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com have it. And if you go to my site, we talked earlier about how to figure out if you have time and money and those kinds of things. So I have this amazing marketing firm that I'm working with, and we created this diagnostic quiz. So if you're curious about sort of where you fit into the picture, you can go to the website, patrickmcginnis.com, take the quiz, and obviously we have a link to buy the book there as well.
Perfect. Well, absolutely to check that out, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Craftsman Founder Podcast with Lucas Carlson. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll pass along our web address, craftsmanfounder.com, to your friends and colleagues. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a Craftsman Founder production. Join us next time for another edition of the Craftsman Founder Podcast.